together with Dr. Jane is her assistant and collaborator, Sue Haley. So, again, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm just going to try and share my screen and hope that that part of the IT is going to work. If you can keep me updated, Sue, on whether
you're sharing.
Actually...
Yes, you're sharing.
I am sharing.
Not full screen yet.
Full screen now?
Full screen now, yes.
Fabulous. Well, I'm just going to start because we've got quite a lot to get through in what is actually quite a short time. It might seem like a long time, but there's a huge amount to get through. So we've already been introduced, so I'm just going to jump straight in. And what we're going to talk about today is intimate partner homicide and what we call the timeline, which is the kind of a chronological sequence of events that typically tends to happen leading up to a homicide. But first of all, I do want to talk, a little bit about the scale of the issue we're talking about. This is a much bigger issue than most people think. And then I will talk about the idea of coercive control. And coercive control is really important because it's been found to be the best framework for understanding domestic abuse. So for, decades and decades, if not longer, we have understood domestic abuse largely through the lens of violence and assaults. But we all know that it's much, much more than violence. And in some cases, there's not really any evidence of serious or injurious violence at all. So the research in this area has found that control and controlling patterns are more important indicators of risk than violence on its own. So I am going to, for the first probably few slides, first half an hour even, we are going to talk about coercive control and what it looks like and what is motivating the perpetrators. So most of the discussion we have today will be about the perpetrators, the controlling people, what's motivating them, and what's making them escalate in risk. But as I said, let's just talk about the scale of the issue first. Now, certainly in the UK, I don't know about Iceland, but we don't count all of our domestic abuse related deaths. Now, we do count our homicides, the ones that have been prosecuted, the ones that have been identified as homicides, where we've got convictions, things like that. We do count them. And that's the middle column in this graph that's labelled homicide. And in England and Wales, it's been around 2 women a week for a very long time. But that really is a partial picture. So you can see the third column there, which reflects domestic abuse related suicide, not suicide in any other context. So where somebody has taken their life and they were suffering domestic abuse or controlling patterns or stalking at the time they died. Now we didn't formally record those numbers until very recently. I think it's only in the last 12 months that we have started making an effort to record. I think that France have been doing it a bit longer than us. So they have actually published some figures. I think the trouble with domestic abuse related suicide, one of the problems anyway, is that you have to identify when somebody has taken their own life, that there was domestic abuse and that it was relevant. Those kinds of things, I think authorities are going to struggle with when they're saying which cases are domestic abuse related suicides. But this is the number that we came up with, looking at some research that was done that estimated the proportion of suicides that could be related to domestic abuse. And you can see that that number far outweighs the homicide figure. And there's lots of things going on in the area of suicide. We've had our first conviction in England and Wales for manslaughter in a case of suicide, saying that the suicide was directly attributable, really, to the perpetrator's actions. We've also had a recent landmark finding, really, in an inquest, saying that the victim's mental health was a direct result of the domestic abuse and stalking. That was, you can look that up if you want to, that was a woman called Jessica Laverack. And the woman who, they got a conviction for manslaughter, that was Justine Rees. We've also seen some people now using the civil system. There's a case in Scotland where a family, the family of Emily Test, 17, 18-year-old student who took her own life allegedly. They are using the civil system to pursue for damages with the perpetrator, as he was not convicted of anything to do with Emily's suicide. But we're seeing lots of movement, and I know that France are seriously looking at suicides caused by domestic abuse or stalking. Now, the third column there, which is the first on the picture, we've labelled HH, and that relates to some work that we have been doing around cases where there has been a sudden, unexpected death, where the victim was suffering domestic abuse, control or stalking, and where somebody has raised a concern that the circumstances of that death were suspicious. So that maybe something like, a fall from a balcony, a sex game gone wrong, that kind of thing. Somebody, either a family member or a professional, has said, no, the circumstances of this are all wrong. There's something wrong here. But for whatever reason, there has not been an investigation by the police, or there has not been a prosecution. So that number is really, really difficult to calculate, because we don't record deaths by falls that are not seen as suspicious at all. So we did do some work with an investigative journalist, looking at if anyone was recording these numbers, and some police forces had made some effort to record, and we were looking at the amount of cases that came across our desk. Me and Sue, we look at a lot of these cases for people, and we kind of merged them together, and that's the number we came up with. It is only an estimate. There's nothing formal about that number, but, crucially, you can see that number is even a bit higher than the homicide column. So if you put all of those together, you can see that the scale is more than we think it is, way more. So it's something that I think is worth our attention. Now, I've said that coercive control is definitely implicated in these deaths. It is the best framework for understanding domestic abuse. So just for the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about how we interpreted the research that has been done in this area to explain what that is saying coercive control is. Now, in our country and in Ireland and in Scotland and in some other places now, coercive control is being criminalised. And that's at least in part because it is implicated in a very, very high percentage of homicides and domestic abuse related suicides. It is in fact a better marker than violence on its own for predicting risk. So what is coercive control? So we've just put some single line explanations there. I think the top one is really, really helpful for anybody trying to think about risk and think about control, and that is, it is a pattern of behaviour that traps people in relationships. So that's the motivation, that's the abuse, and that is what the victim is suffering. And that, if you remember nothing else, if you remember that about coercive control, it will kind of explain everything, because everything relates back to that as we go through the risk escalation. So if somebody's trapped in a relationship, and it's the intention of the perpetrator that they are trapped in that relationship, it creates what people have described, researchers have described, as a kind of a hostage situation. So you're in a situation that you can't get out of because there's some kind of threat to you if you do try and get out of that situation. It does reduce the victim's choices and their space for action. Those things are gradually and sometimes quite quickly actually taken away from them. Coercive control manipulates compliance in the victim, so they're not necessarily constantly fighting. They will become compliant with the demands of the perpetrator. And it does also tend to create a relationship hierarchy. So within the relationship, the controlling person sits at the top. They are superior and they have their demands met before anybody else in that relationship, which kind of includes the victim and any children as well. Now, this next slide is like a visual depiction of coercive control, and we've used an umbrella to put that across. So if we think of coercive control as the umbrella or the overarching pattern, that is the domestic abuse. So we'll call it coercive control. That's what we are talking about. And all of the things that you see underneath this umbrella are tactics used by the controlling people to achieve control, to enforce control, to introduce control. So violence is an incredibly effective way to make somebody do what you want them to do. And if even partially what you want them to do is stay in the relationship, that's really effective. But so is financial abuse, so is sexual abuse, so is psychological abuse. So coercive control, not an alternative to domestic violence. Coercive control is not non-violent domestic abuse. It's a pattern that may or may not use violence as one of its tactics. In most cases, there is violence. I think it's only around 20% of cases maybe that of homicide where there was no known violence. But having said that, what we have to define violence, and the theorists talking about coercive control have said that any kind of physicality that imposes your will on somebody else will be included in that spectrum of violence. So even if it's just pushing or shoving or sitting on somebody, that counts as violence when we're thinking about risk of what might happen in the future. But as you will know, in a lot of cases, there will be serious violence. So coercive control is not merely psychological abuse. I think that's, that's the message that we want to get across. So the next thing I want to talk about is what we call the 3 C's cycle. So the 3 C's are control, challenge, consequences. And this kind of mini cycle happens over and over and over again and over layers every day, really, in the relationship. Because one thing about coercive control, again, is it's kind of relentless. It goes on all the time. It doesn't just happen on a Saturday night when somebody's drunk. It's gone throughout the week. And it's the consequences part that changes. So I'll just explain this control, challenge, consequence cycle that's going on. So the control is in place. And the easiest way, I think, to think about it is the rules of the relationship are where the control is obvious. So whatever the rules of the relationship are, if they are challenged or resisted, we get into the challenge part of this cycle. If they are challenged or resisted, then there will be consequences for the victim of that. Now, the consequences can vary hugely. The consequences could be an argument. It could be, throwing insults at somebody. The consequences could be serious injury to that victim. So just give you a couple of examples of that. I'll give a very simple example, and it's Sue, if you give the more serious example of Katie. So the first example is a young woman who I was speaking to who was in a relationship with a man. They weren't living together, but they were dating regularly. They were in a permitted relationship. So one night he turned up to pick her up because they were going out on a date. They were going out for a drink or a meal or something, and she'd got dressed up. So she gets into the car and he immediately says to her, "What's that you're wearing? You look like a slut. You look like a slag. What are you trying to do? Pick up men while we're out together? You're trying to make me jealous." So just from learning what that interaction was about, you learn that one of the rules of this relationship is that you don't make me jealous. She'd broken that rule. She'd challenged that rule inadvertently by wearing this dress. So he's shouting at her, he's insulting her, and he tells her to get out of the car and go and change her dress. She's very, very upset about this. She goes in, she does change her dress, and she says, "I'll never wear that dress again. I won't make that mistake again," because she's frightened of the consequences. So the control is re-established at that point. She will never do that again. Do you want to talk about Katie there for a minute, Sue?
Absolutely, yeah. Katie Wilding was a 19-year-old girl who met a much older man. He was 12 years older than her. And at the beginning of the relationship, of course, Katie idolised him, did everything she could for him. But she worked, he didn't. And one morning she got up, ready to get herself ready for work, and she made a cup of coffee and she took the last of the milk. She didn't think anything about it. She went off to work. Some hours later, Mitchell Richardson, that was the man's name, he woke up and discovered there was no milk for his coffee. And instead of doing what you or I might do and go to the local supermarket, the local shop, and get a pint of milk for his coffee, he got up and he got dressed and he went to Katie's place of work. She was a hairdresser. She worked in a hair salon. And he went into the salon and completely lost his temper with her, berating her, spitting in her face. He threw a bunch of keys at her that marked her face. He was so violent and angry that 2 men who were in the barber's side of the salon had to remove him. And afterwards, the owner of the salon didn't call the police. They called Katie's mum, and Katie's mum went down to the salon to sort things out. But Katie took it upon herself. It was her fault that he had responded like that because she'd taken the milk. She caused the argument. And, you know, she decided in that moment that she was never going to leave him without milk again. But in terms of the 3 C's, you know, the control was that, you know, Katie had to prioritise Mitchell Richardson every day. That was her prime motivation, was to look after him and his needs. And by not leaving him with milk for his coffee, for his morning coffee, you know, she's challenged that control. And the consequences of that were that he went to her place of work and berated her and assaulted her. So, you know, when Katie then said that she would never let that happen again, the control was re-established. And so it went round again. But that, you know, that relationship got worse and worse with the control that Katie...
Wasn't it?
Absolutely.
You know, there's a case I'm involved in at the moment where the victim had her behaviour monitored from the minute she got up in the morning. He would complain that she breathed too loudly, or she shut the doors too loudly, or she didn't make the breakfast properly. You know, how you haven't cut my sandwich in the shapes that I like it cut in. You haven't cut enough fat off the bacon, whatever. These are all routines, rituals, rules of the relationship. So it's quite interesting if you're speaking to a victim and they talk about an incident where perhaps the consequences are serious, and you know, they attract the attention of the police or somebody else, and there's been an injury, to find out exactly which rule they broke and what the consequences usually were. So this is what we say about risk planning, knowing this. So you'll interview the victim. Maybe you'll formulate some safety actions with that victim. So change the locks on your door, or get a protective order, you know, whatever your advice might be. So we would always say, when you've done that, find out what the consequences might be for the action that the victim's taking, because the action will be breaking one of the rules of the relationship, which is probably never to report them, never to badmouth them, never tell the police about them, never to support prosecution, never take out a protective order, whatever it is. So if you say to the victim, like, we've asked you to change the locks on the door, what are the consequences likely to be of that? What would happen if? The what would happen if questions. They might say to you, oh, I don't know, you know, they'll probably just go off in a temper or whatever, and I'll get some nasty texts, so you know what the consequences are. They might say, well, they'll just kick the door in. If the victim thinks that they'll kick the door in, they're probably not going to change the locks, which means then, you know, you might look at that victim and say, well, they're not helping us help them. But you really do have to think about consequences, because coercive control is rooted in consequences. Evan Stark, who you've probably heard of if you know anything about coercive control, Professor Evan Stark says, you know, that controlling people set in the mind of the victim the price of their resistance. And that's really what we're talking about. What is the price they pay for not towing the line and not agreeing to be controlled? So this is just like a little graph, which is like an indication of what coercive control might look like if you tracked it across a number of days we've put here just as an example, and measured the scale of the consequences that a victim was suffering on a daily basis. So in this this one, we've got Monday here. The consequences are quite low level, so might be arguing, maybe pushing, shoving, maybe something like, you know, well, no, I'm not gonna take the kids to school, or I'm having the car, I'm not letting you have the car. But by Wednesday, we've got one which is right up here, hitting an 80 on our kind of Richter scale of consequences, which actually might be a very serious assault. And the police will see maybe what happened on Wednesday, but they'll know nothing about what happened on Monday and Tuesday, which is the context really for what happened on Wednesday. So it's just something to remember about coercive control. It's always there, always, always, always. But the consequences might not always be serious, but they're keeping that victim compliant because they're avoiding things like Wednesday. So 3 questions this came out of the United States, these 3 questions, to identify coercive control or stalking in a kind of a triage thing. So 1, is it a pattern of behaviour? Coercive control is a pattern. It kind of happens over and over again. Is the pattern making someone change their daily routines and activities? Have they changed the way they dress? Have they changed what friends they are seeing and speaking to? Have they changed their social activity? You know, have they changed their social media activity? Lots of families will say to you, you know, she's changed. I mean, she just doesn't seem as happy and bubbly as she used to be. So have a look around that. If it's stalking, you might get somebody changing their route to work, changing their phone number again. And is this making someone afraid, is your third question. So we will just very briefly talk about fear, because 2 types of fear that have been identified, 1 immediate fear, 2 chronic fear, and they both look very different to each other, but kind of coexist together. So immediate fear is that type of fear that we all recognize. We've all felt it, we've all seen it. You know, it's if somebody has a baseball bat, somebody's wielding a baseball bat and threatening them with it, they will go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn. You know, the usually they might cry, they might shake, they might run, they might fight, they might aggressively defend themselves. You know, some people freeze completely. So we all recognize immediate fear. We know what it is. And when somebody is in a state of immediate fear, that is the most likely time that the police or other services will be called. But the body cannot maintain immediate fear for long periods of time. And I think another problem is we expect to see immediate fear all the time. We want to see a victim who's visibly what we consider to be afraid, visibly afraid. That makes us recognize that there is a threat. The problem with that is a lot of the time victims will be in this state, not in a state of immediate fear. They will be in a state of chronic fear. So chronic fear is something that builds up over time. It's built up through experience of that perpetrator, what they're capable of, what they're likely to do, what consequences you are trying to avoid. In this country, we call that kind of walking on eggshells around somebody. So your victims are living in this perpetual state of trying to manage the consequences, trying to manage this person's mood swings, trying to keep them happy and stable. So their behavior may look really strange to us. And certainly sometimes we think, well, why aren't they doing this? Why are they doing that? Which is why I've put the picture up of somebody with their hand up like that. The hand is kind of saying, stop, stop, back off, go away. And as police officers and, you know, social workers, children's services, medical services, you may well come across victims of domestic abuse who just want you to back off, who don't want you to do anything, or are telling you to go. And I've seen, you know, social workers or police officers attacked, insulted, shouted at. And you think, God, I'm just trying to help you. Why are you doing this? It's quite possible that this is brought about by chronic fear, because your presence is breaking one of the rules of the relationship. You don't tell anyone. You don't get anyone else involved. You don't badmouth me. You don't, you know, say that I'm doing anything criminal. You don't put me in any danger. And your mere presence might do that. So I'm not saying you shouldn't be there at all. You should be there. But recognize that the victim might behave in a way that appears illogical to you, but is highly logical to them. So, you know, it's that the story I tell, which I'm not going to tell the whole story, but, you know, when I was a police officer, I went to a domestic abuse call, and the victim, who had been hit in the head with a lump hammer, would not get in the ambulance. So why wouldn't you get in the ambulance? This is the thing. So that seems like an illogical behavior. But the thing is, getting in the ambulance may have got her a worse beating later on. Why did you get in the ambulance? Why did you go to the hospital? Drawing attention to yourself, bad-mouthing me, making me look bad. So always be aware of chronic fear. It's about trying to keep somebody happy. And if the victim doesn't think that you can keep them safe, they're probably going to just try and keep themselves safe. So that's the kind of context, really, of coercive control. So I think we can move on now to the timeline itself. So the timeline is a sequence made up of 8 clear stages. Each stage represents an escalation in risk to the victim. I'm just going to play this very short film which shows all of the 8 stages, one after the other, before we start talking. Okay, so we're just now going to talk about each stage one by one, explaining why that stage exists and what you might expect to see in that stage. We do have some films which we're going to play from a man called Clive Ruggles, who is the father of Alice Ruggles, a young woman who was murdered in this country by her coercively controlling boyfriend. And we will play one small film from Clive for every stage as a kind of example of what's going on. So stage 1, this is mostly before the controlling person and the victim have even met. Now, because coercive control is not a product of the dynamics between two people, history is really important. Coercive control is a mindset, a kind of belief system of the controlling person. It wouldn't matter who they were in a relationship with, they are going to be controlling. They might use different tactics on different victims, but the control will be there. They are repeat and serial offenders. So if we want to identify if anybody is that type, we could call them controlling, then one of the best places to look is their history. Do they have a history of domestic abuse, of stalking, of controlling patterns? Do they have previous arrests for violence in any context? This is important. The research is telling us that controlling people who use violence will use it in, if it's their go-to way of dealing with their issues, they will probably use violence in the relationship if they're happy to use it outside of the relationship. There are some, of course, that just keep their violence to their partner. But if somebody has a history, a police record for violence, that's very high risk. Not necessarily that they're going to be a killer, I don't mean that, but it makes them high risk for controlling patterns and domestic abuse and stalking. One of the problems, though, that we do have is we cannot rely on just looking at somebody's criminal record to see if they are of this stage 1 or not. And the reason for that is we just don't get enough convictions. We don't get enough people through the criminal system being convicted of domestic abuse related offences. So we found that certainly in the 400 cases we looked at for this research, and we have looked at way more than 400 cases, I can tell you it's probably well over 1,000, across the research we've done and the cases that we work on, is listening to what previous partners have said. It's listening to what families say. It's listening to what victims say if they're still alive at this point. If they're saying, oh, well, he had this crazy ex-girlfriend and she was a proper problem and she used to make him look bad and she was vengeful and she couldn't get over him leaving her. That's a history. This is not a prosecution. This is a risk assessment, risk escalation process. So you need to just take on board any information that you can that is going to help you with any decisions that you have to make. So if they're saying the crazy ex, I mean, that for me is like, okay, I know what's going on here. You're not taking any responsibility and you're just saying that all your exes are crazy. In this country, we have something called the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, which I don't know if you have in Iceland, but what that means is that the police can go to a new partner and say, your partner has a history of domestic abuse. We think you should know. And also we've got an add-on to that, which is known as Clare's Law, which says that a victim can go to the police and request that information. So I'm not saying it runs brilliantly because, there are problems with it, but what it does show is the importance of history, that they have that process in place. They are saying, look, history is really important, so we're putting this in place to make sure victims have all of the information that they need. Most victims will believe the stories about any ex-partners. And if any incident with this person or something that you know about is in relation to the breakdown of a relationship, definitely stage 1, absolutely, definitely. If there's no relationship history known, or there hasn't been one, look for patterns of jealousy and possessiveness. And I'm saying patterns of jealousy. I'm not saying somebody was jealous in one incident at one time. This is like routine jealousy. This is forming a relationship and making one of the rules of the relationship, you don't make me jealous, and I'm going to enforce that on a daily basis because I'm a bit paranoid. And being able to see your children and your partner as literally possessions. You have ownership rights over them. And if you think back to coercive control being about trapping someone in a relationship, you can see that somebody who thinks they've got ownership rights would see that, you know, I'm entitled to do this. But we'll just listen to Clive now.
We didn't know it at the time, but Dylan did have a previous history. A couple of years before he met Alice, when he was stationed down in Faversham in Kent, he had a previous girlfriend. And when she finished with him, there was an incident where he'd gone after her, encountered her and her new boyfriend in the shopping centre in Faversham and spat in their faces. And he'd had a restraining order taken out against him because of that. But then nothing more happened because pretty soon after that, the army moved him up to Edinburgh.
So Clive is clearly there talking about an incident linked to the breakdown of a relationship. Do you want to really quickly, Sue, tell about Katie's history?
Yeah, absolutely. Katie Wilding again. History of Mitchell Richardson was when he first met Katie, he had a tag on his ankle for an offence where he had beaten the new boyfriend of an ex-girlfriend very badly. But he kept it hidden from Katie until he needed to actually move in with her. But yeah, he had a violent past. In fact, but it wasn't linked to domestic abuse because he'd attacked another man. It was just looked at by the police as, violence, but not against a woman. But it was caused. He did lie. Yeah, he did lie about it. And minimised it, that it was, he was trying to protect the woman from this man that was at her property, not telling the truth about, it was a jealous rage of his to beat this man up because he was with his girlfriend, what he saw as his property, his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend.
So it is, look into the history of these people if you have that information and ask questions. If you're out at a call or you're meeting with the family, and quite often this information will come up. Stage 2 is what we call the early relationship. So this is when a perpetrator meets somebody who they want to be in a relationship with. Now, we found that this stage is of fairly short duration. It certainly has a time limit on it. And everything happens fast and everything happens intensely. So they might move in together quite quickly. There might be an early pregnancy. They might start declaring their love for each other quite quickly. But what's happening in stage 2 is almost like a grooming process. So the controlling person will want to get a commitment to a relationship from that person as quickly as they possibly can. Now, what a commitment looks like differs. So it could be the first time you have sex with them. It could be the first time they declare love. It could be when you move in together. It'll differ for different controlling people. But they are really, really keen to get that commitment, because once they get the commitment, they feel they have rights in the relationship, and now the victim has responsibilities. And the possessiveness and the jealousy usually come in really, really quickly. They will also resist attempts for things to be taken slower. Sometimes the victim is not interested. Sometimes they are as interested as this controlling person appears to be. But the controlling person will always be kind of intense once they feel that they can jump in and get a commitment. So we'll just listen to Clive talking about stage 2 with his daughter Alice.
We first met Dylan when he and Alice came together down to visit us bank holiday weekend at the beginning of May in 2016. At that point, they'd only really been going out together physically for 3 or 4 weeks in total, 2 weeks in January and 2 more weeks since he'd been back. And yet they seemed incredibly close. And he was talking to me about all the ways he was going to look after her. I remember in particular, he was talking about buying her a house so that she could live in the house even when he was off on tour somewhere. Extraordinary way of talking for someone who'd only known her for such a short period of time.
Yeah, I think what Clive is saying there, things moved really quickly. And actually, with Alice and Harry Dillon, they were saying that they were in a committed relationship before they physically met, because they met on Facebook, I think, certainly on social media. And it went that fast that they were committing to each other before they had even met. There's a lot more to say about stage 2, but unfortunately today we don't have a huge amount of time to go into some of the casework that we've done. But I think that gives you an idea about stage 2. So stage 3 is the relationship stage. So we've come out of stage 2, they've got their commitment, and now what we have is a relationship dominated by controlling patterns. There could be violence, there might not be. And we've just put some of the examples of tactics they might use to enforce control or manipulate compliance, get this person to start being compliant with everything they want. I'm not going to talk about stage 3 for a long time, but it's important to say stage 3 can last any length of time. It can last a matter of weeks or even less, or it can last literally a lifetime. We have cases at 2 ends of the spectrum, don't we, Sue? So we got Claire Bernal, 3 weeks.
Yeah.
3
before
weeks. The decision was made to kill her after 3 weeks.
Mm.
But then we have George and Edna.
George and Edna, who were married for 54 years. And yeah, this stage existed the whole time they were together until something happened, and George ended Edna's life. But yeah, do you want me to talk about the routines, or should we? No, okay.
We've got
little time, haven't we? But yeah,
we've got about 7 minutes before they need a coffee break. So it would be lovely to talk about the routines, wouldn't it, and the rituals.
Yeah, it would. It's very interesting.
But I think what we've got time to say is that this is the relationship stage. It will be dominated by controlling patterns. The police may or may not get involved. Social services may or may not get involved. We don't know. And we know that it can last any length of time. So we can't judge risk based on the length of time that 2 people have been together. So even in the stalking research, they say that this kind of entitlement, ownership feeling in the perpetrator can even come from a one-night stand. I think that's more unusual in the context we're talking about, but certainly that can be formed in the first weeks. And I think with Katie, I think I'm right in saying, Sue, that the grooming stage, the stage 2, ended almost overnight when they moved in together.
Absolutely. As soon as he had conned his way, and he did con his way into living in Katie's flat, he stopped, he changed, and he became this horrible, sulking bully that dominated Katie's life after he'd been Mr. Charm himself in order to secure his accommodation with Katie. Horrible man.
Yeah, and she said Julie says, her mum, by the end of the first week after they moved in together, the serious violence had started and smashing up the flat. But we'll just listen to Clive before you have your coffee break, talking about stage 3.
Over the next couple of months, May and June of 2016, the relationship rapidly deteriorated. Alice began to lose friends, and she didn't really, at the time, know why. She fell out with the 3 lads she'd been sharing a house with. They'd been great up to then. They played in a band. She used to sing with the band, many things. Then all of a sudden she was saying, I can't speak to them anymore. I can't live with them. I'm going to have to move out. And she did actually move out to go and move in with a friend, Maxine, from work, from Sky, where she worked. And we didn't realise till afterwards, but what was happening was that Dylan was basically manipulating any little differences or feuds between friends. He'd get in there on both sides, saying that the other person, saying to Alice that they'd been saying things they hadn't been saying to them that she'd been saying things she hadn't been saying, basically making things worse. And what this was about was gradually not only controlling her, but also isolating her from other friends. He'd say things like, "You've got hairy arms. I like girls with hairy arms, but most guys wouldn't like a girl with hairy arms." Things that were trying to sap her confidence. And he'd also become more and more controlling, wanting to know what she was wearing every day as before she went out. If she said that she was going out with friends of an evening, he'd want to know about that. In 1 or 2 occasions, he even turned up, having driven all the way down from Edinburgh, just to see what she was doing.
So we see patterns of control really building in stage 2. Perhaps you just want to, you've got 2 minutes, Sue, to talk about the patterns in George and Edna's life.
Well, yes. I mean, this couple met in the 1950s, obviously. They got married within very short time, really. But that wasn't unusual then, I don't think. But their whole lives was dominated by a routine for every hour, every day. You know, they went shopping on the same day. They bought the same food. They went to the same social outlet every week, sat at the same table, drank the same drinks. I mean, their lives were absolutely regimented by control. And we know that George was the instigator of that control because although we said that there was no relationship with the police in terms of violence between the two, that he was a regular misdemeanor to the police about people parking outside his house or doing this, you know. So he was well known for his Mr. Angry sort of act, I think.
And he used to get angry, didn't he? Like if they were saying if somebody took his seat in the social club, he would lose it. Or if his brand of coffee wasn't available in the supermarket.
Yeah, very, very angry person. But, you know, there was no reported violence between them. But I'm sure that Edna didn't have a very nice life, really.
I think she got used to the...
She put up with it, didn't she?
Yeah.
She got used to it. But, yeah, and his children were used to it too. They grew up with it, and there was no violence, but they just thought that's Dad's way, you know? That's how he is.
Everybody was frightened to break his routines, though.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shall I just mention... just before you have your coffee, a case we are going to talk about in a minute about a man me and Sue went to visit in prison, who had one of the routines of his relationship, rules of the relationship was that the evening meal was at 5 o'clock every night, and everybody turned up at 5 o'clock because although there was no real reported violence in that relationship. Everyone was too scared to break that routine because the consequences were so unpleasant and they knew that they'd be far-reaching. And maybe he had used violence on 1 or 2 occasions, but his partner and the children would all be there at 5 o'clock, no matter what. The victim couldn't even get a job that went past 5 o'clock. This routine was enforced so strictly. So, you know, it's not always just about having a temper, losing that temper and hitting somebody. But anyway, it is your coffee break now. I think we're coming back at 20 past, so you've got 20 minutes for coffee. We will talk about how stage 3 does come to an end, when it comes to an end, when we talk about stage 4, when we come back.
Yes. I will just leave you on so that...
Mute the sound.
Yes, okay. Where do I mute the sound?
Yeah, we'll just turn our cameras off.
Yeah.
Mér langar áður en þær halda áfram, þá langar mig að segja frá því að ég fattaði það að það kemur ekki fram í kynningunni á Jane, þessari skrifuðu kynningu sem ég var með, og hún sagði heldur ekki frá því þegar hún byrjaði, en þessi vinna hennar, þessi greiningarvinna hennar á því sem hún kallar the homicide timeline niður í 8 stig, hún byggir á rannsóknum á 400 kvennamorðum í Bretlandi, Englandi og Wales. Og hún sagði sagt, sko, hún afbrotafræðingur í grunninn og fyrrverandi lögreglumaður og heldur síðan áfram inn í akademíuna. Og og hún sagði sagt, greindi aðdraganda þessara 400 kvennamorða og á þeim grunni kemur þessi analýs hennar, þessi analýsa hennar á þessum 8 stigum, og eins og kom reyndar fram þá hefur hún síðan skoðað 600 case til viðbótar. Þau þurfa ekki öll að hafa endað í 8. stigi en þau eru öll á þessu rófi og falla undir þetta hugtak sem hún notar, sem coercive control. Það vantar gott íslenskt orð yfir það. Ég hef stundum notað þvingunarstjórnun, en við bara finnum út úr því. Okay, Jane, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
I was just explaining because I realized that it wasn't in my introduction of you, the written introduction, your study of the 400 femicides in England and Wales, how it formed the basis of what you are talking about here, just to make a point of clarification. Okay, so please proceed. Yeah, please proceed. It's impressive. Yeah.
Okay, are you there, Sue?
I am.
You
Can't
are.
you see me?
No, I can't at the moment.
Okay.
I can't see you.
I'm here.
Yeah, it's a bit disconcerting not being able to see you, actually. Can you see me?
I can see you, yeah.
All right. Yes, Hilda's absolutely right. The research that this timeline is based on, we looked at around 400 cases, but we've looked at many, many more since then. And there have been some other researchers who've kind of tested the timeline, and it's coming out as pretty dominant, you know, wherever you are in the world. It seems to be as common, you know, in other places as it was in the cases we looked at. And we have looked at other cases from across the world. And the book that I wrote about the research has been published in China and Russia and Turkey, and, you know, interpreted into those languages. So this is, I think, of international relevance because it's about human behaviour rather than specific to our country. Anyway, we'll move on then to stage 4. Now, stage 4 is where the risk starts to rise. So you've got this relationship that is dominated by controlling patterns. It's going on and on. What brings it to an end? So it's what we call a trigger. Now, across all of the research that we could find across the world, the single biggest trigger for things to escalate and become a lot more dangerous is separation. A threat of a separation, or the controlling person imagines there will be a separation. So thinking back to coercive control being about, trapping somebody in a relationship, it seems logical that, wouldn't it, that the biggest threat to that relationship would be separation. So we did find some other triggers as well. Bankruptcy and financial ruin was one, and in the research, bankruptcy and financial ruin does have a link to what we call familicide. So that is where the victim, the partner, and the children might get killed, and the perpetrator may take their own life at the scene as well. I'm sure you've seen those cases. They are less common, but they do exist. They're almost entirely male perpetrated. So I'll just very quickly talk about sex and gender here. So with intimate partner homicide, predominantly, the victims will be female and the perpetrators will be male. However, we also found that men in relationships with other men are at higher risk than men in relationships with women. So homicide in this in every context really, is mainly perpetrated by men. So intimate partner homicides are a gendered phenomenon. That is not to say that women do not kill their intimate partners, because we know they do. They do it in much, much smaller numbers. So, I mean, there's different statistics come out in different countries, but the global homicide report, which looks at, this situation across the globe, says that over 80% of victims will be female with a male perpetrator, and that 90% of homicide offenders will be male. So we can't escape that fact. So we know then that the people at most risk are people in relationships with men, whether they are men or women, but predominantly in a homicide, in this category, women are mainly going to be the victims. We have looked at cases where women have killed men in this context. Now, there was some research done in England and Wales recently by the Centre for Women's Justice, and they found that where women were killing their intimate partners, 77% of the cases they looked at, it was in response to them being a victim of domestic abuse. So they were killing their abuser. But that does leave a proportion of female killers of their partners not responding to domestic abuse, and them being the abusers themselves. And we have looked at those cases too. And in those cases where the women were not victims of stalking or domestic abuse, but had still killed their partner, they followed this timeline in much the same way as the men do. So they are out there, they do exist. It's just in smaller numbers, that's all. Right, so the trigger stage, separation, I've talked about bankruptcy and financial ruin. So we're talking about life changes here, big relationship changes. So we also found in some cases physical health deterioration in the offender or the victim, or mental health deterioration in the offender or the victim can be a trigger for things to escalate. Life changes like redundancy or retirement, where the two are perhaps spending a lot more time together. And I think importantly, the victim is not getting any respite from the abuse. That can change the whole dynamic of what's going on. And one thing that I haven't put on the slide, which I perhaps should, is pregnancy. So some people will say that when they got pregnant, that's when the abuse started. It's far more likely, and is upheld more in the research, that the control was always there, but it escalates during pregnancy. It gets more visible. People start noticing it. And it could be any kind of event which prompts retaliation or revenge. But what we found, interestingly, was that even where the trigger was bankruptcy maybe, or physical health deterioration, there was a fear in the controlling person that would lead to a separation. So I think that's worth talking about for a minute, because I'll give you the example of a case from the Republic of Ireland, and a man who was not known to have ever used any violence, although sexual violence was definitely in that relationship. But anyway, this man was going to lose his job because of his behaviour, and he was really concerned about this. His wife and 3 little boys did not know about it. And if you want to look up this case, you can. It's a man called Alan Hawe, Hawe, and he murdered his wife Clodagh and their 3 little boys. But he said that when Clodagh finds out about what has happened in the school where I work, she will leave me. So even though the trigger was something that was going to be a massive life change for him, may have been a humiliation for him, a concern of his was that he would lose his family because of it. So he decided to kill them all, and then he took his own life as well. But redundancy, retirement can be the same. The victims can get very, because they get no respite, they can make that final decision to leave. Much like Edna did, we talked about George and Edna. That's what she did, didn't she, Sue?
Yes, she did. But it was also due to George's physical health deterioration. He developed something called labyrinthinitis, I think. Labyrinth, sorry. I never get it right. I always trip up over that. But it meant it physically impaired him, and he wasn't able to do all the things he used to do, or he was used to doing. He played golf several times a week with his friends. They would go on holidays, same time, same place every year, but he was told by his GP he couldn't fly. So it impacted on his daily routine. And he became so upset about this, and became very, more annoying for Edna than he had been. She confided to some friends, and they shared the same friendship group, that she'd had enough and she was going to leave him. So it was like, there were 2 triggers there. One was his physical health, and it was also, he found out that she was planning to leave him. So.
Yes, so it's interesting, isn't it, that in a lot of cases, even if there was a different trigger, that got related to the fear of separation. But that fear of separation has got nothing to do with love, because, as you'll hear when Clive talks, Harry Dillon was actually in multiple relationships, and yet he still killed Alice. So it's about a sense of possession and ownership, and a fear of rejection. So we'll just listen to Clive talk about stage 4.
At some point in July, Alice was contacted on social media by a girl she didn't know. And this girl said, "Do you realise your boyfriend's cheating on you?" And what had been happening was that even during those 2 or 3 months when he'd been going out with Alice, he was actually dating other girls. He'd had relationships with 2 or 3 of them. And this particular girl who was dating him on Tinder did some research and discovered that he already had a girlfriend online and took the initiative to approach Alice. And of course, when that happened, Alice, almost despite herself, she broke off with Dylan at that point, broke off the relationship. And that was the trigger. That was when his control within the relationship turned to stalking.
So this stage 5 then is the controlling person's response to the trigger. What do they do when this trigger event happens that threatens their control over the relationship, their control over the victim or their children? So we've called this stage escalation. So this is when things get worse. So the concerning behaviours might become more frequent, more serious, more severe. And as Clive has just mentioned, this is where stalking can start. We might see threats to kill or threats to suicide at this stage. They may become more angry and more desperate. A language like, I won't let you leave, I can't live without you, if I can't have you, no one can. So this is the context in which everything's happening. And what we found was they tend to throw everything at this situation at this point. So they may beg, cry, promise to change. They may become violent, aggressive, harassing. They may text constantly or message constantly, but things ratchet up. Things tend to become worse in this threat to the relationship. Now, stage 5 is very difficult as well, because although it becomes quite obvious that things are getting worse, there's no time length I can give you for stage 5. So it's largely about keeping an eye on what is going on, because one of 3 things tends to happen in stage 5. So the first thing would be that there is a separation, and after a period of escalation or stalking or post-separation abuse, the controlling person eventually moves on. Then is one way of describing it. They move on and the relationship is separated. So that just means that this controlling person circles back to stage 1. They are now somebody, again, with a history, who's looking for their next relationship. So what we're saying really is they're always on this timeline somewhere. Where are they? Are they at stage 1? Are they at stage 2? They rarely come off this timeline unless there is some serious intervention with their worldview, their behaviours and their patterns. The second thing that can happen commonly is that all of this activity in stage 5 actually reinstates the relationship. So the threat goes away, the two get back together, if you like. So what happens then is both of them circle back to stage 3. They're now both in a relationship again that is dominated by controlling patterns. But every time it reaches stage 5 and they circle back, the control tends to get worse, and the outcomes for especially women who keep doing, are in this cycle of 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, over and over and over again. The outcomes are not good for them, for their health, for their mental health, for the potential outcomes as well. The third thing that can happen is that they progress to stage 6 after a period in stage 5. But most controlling people will stop progressing. They won't progress to stage 6. They will circle back. That tends to be what happens. And when they do circle back, the risk tends to de-escalate, but it escalates further if they progress on to stage 6. So we know that most domestic abuse does not end in homicide. A lot of cases do, big enough that this requires our attention, but statistically, most will circle and just keep having these awful relationships. Now, I'm going to talk about some things that can happen in stage 5, and I think, Clive mentioned stalking, and stalking is really important in this stage. So let's just hear Clive talking about what happened after the separation.
Once she broke off the relationship, he then started to bombard her with messages on her phone, with social media stuff. He controlled her Facebook. He'd got the password to it, and started to threaten her that he'd release some pictures he had of her without her knowledge or permission. And at that, she ended up having to take down the Facebook account in order to stop him doing that. Hundreds of messages a day, hundreds of texts, hundreds of her phone was constantly pinging with messages. And they were a mixture of emotional blackmail, him crying down the phone, threatening suicide, saying he couldn't live without her, all that sort of stuff. But also increasingly veiled threats. Veiled threats was the way he did it. So it was always, if I weren't a nice guy, I might do this, but I am, so I won't. But a veiled threat is definitely a threat.
So it looks as if, in this stage, what the immediate motivation with all of this escalation is to get the relationship back under their control, and they're going to use any means to do that. So we've already talked about begging and crying, and I think we need to talk about promises to change and grand gestures as well. So we've seen quite a few cases where they make this grand gesture to get the relationship back under their control. So things like, for example, a sudden proposal of marriage, something, that they know that the victim has wanted throughout the relationship maybe, but they haven't done it. They may make the grand gesture of, I'll go and get counselling. Let's go and do couples therapy, something they've never done before, but suddenly they're willing to throw this at the relationship. Now, we get really concerned, me and Sue, when we hear about a grand gesture, because they come with consequences. When somebody is saying that the only reason really I'm asking you to marry me is because I need to reinstate this relationship, very often they will think they've been forced into that position, and they can become very resentful of that. So the proposal of marriage, the counselling, the holiday, the let's get a mortgage together, comes with a cost, comes with a price. And I'm always very, very concerned about victims who think that it's a sign of change rather than a sign of desperation. It's very difficult sometimes to convince people that it could potentially be quite risky for them to accept a proposal under these circumstances, because I'm always concerned about what the price is going to be for them afterwards. Because once they get the commitment back, again, you just go straight into, right, got the commitment, now I can start throwing the control at this relationship again. Another thing that we don't recognise that happens in stage 5 is aggressive family court battles, custody battles over children, sometimes vexatious litigation. We seem to have a belief that because a relationship has ended, that the two people are merely vengeful towards each other or have such bad feeling towards each other they cannot agree on anything. Now that does happen in some cases, but what we are finding certainly in many countries is that once the victim says, you know, there was domestic abuse in this relationship, that is not believed, even if there's evidence, even if the police have been called out, even if it's tracked across history. It's seen as, well, you're only throwing that at the relationship now because you want to get custody. It is of crucial importance that in any family court proceedings that coercive control is identified or not, identified where it exists, because coercive control is dangerous for children too. These controlling people feel exactly the same about their entitlement to control their children as they do their entitlement to control their partner. And that is never good for children. So it is of, I say it again, crucial importance that in cases where there seems to be very aggressive child custody battles, that coercive control is identified if it is relevant, and it is in some cases. But what I'm going to talk about now is stalking, because this is really, really important in terms of risk escalation as well. So stalking is a criminalised pattern in some countries, not in others. I really don't know about Iceland if you have criminalised stalking, but it's a pattern of behaviour, and you can see the mnemonic there on the photograph. It is fixated, obsessed, unwanted, and repeated. So in stage 5, when stalking starts, it is an obsessive behaviour. But what we don't tend to do is also link coercive control as a fixated and obsessive behaviour, because it is. Although stalking and coercive control are two different patterns, they quite often follow each other and are both dominated by this fixated and obsessed worldview of the controlling person. Even if they are, you know, this is something that crosses all demographics as well. There are many, many, many controlling people who are professionals, who they are not all people without work, with alcohol and drug misuse problems. Those people are just very much more visible to us in their abuse. People with power in their life and their work don't always need to resort to physical violence in an obvious way. So always be looking, if control is alleged, just think about, you know, taking that forward, thinking about, is it there? Don't just automatically disbelieve. But anyway, stalking then. There's been some, you know, a lot of research into stalking, their motivations, and especially in this context. So the most influential research that's used in the UK anyway is from what's called the stalking risk profile. And they separate stalkers into 5 different categories. And this research is used in all of our specialist stalking units, and it does have global influence as well. So there are 5 categories of stalker. The category of stalker that we are interested in this context is known as the rejected stalker, and they are responding to the ending of a relationship usually. They feel rejected, they feel resentful, and just bringing up, this is just the for you to know what I'm talking about, but bringing up just some key things about the rejected stalker category. They are the most common group of stalker that there is, making up over 50% of stalkers. They are also the most likely to commit serious harm against their victim. Historically, I think we've looked at stalkers and thought that intimate partner stalkers are the least dangerous. That is not true. It is the opposite, in fact. In some research we were looking at when we're thinking about risk escalation, it was found that over 50% of rejected stalkers will carry out threats that they make, compared to an average of only 10% in other groups. Now, that doesn't mean over 50% will carry out every threat they make, but if they make a threat and then they act on that threat, that is a serious escalation and should be considered in any assessment. So, for example, if a stalker says to their victim, I'm going to be standing outside your office tonight at 5 o'clock, I'll be watching you, I'm going to follow you home, that's the threat. And then they are there at 5 o'clock, that is an escalation in threat to that victim. So it's not necessarily that you only look at threats to kill and think, my God, they're going to carry out that threat. We have to think about the way that the risk is escalating. So a kind of a mini escalation that we saw with stalkers as well is that their motivation can change or can layer over with multiple motivations. So they might start with, I'm stalking this person to exert control in an attempt to reinstate the relationship. They could be motivated to frighten or punish the victim with their stalking behaviours, or they could be, given the monitoring or tracking that often is there in stalking, they actually could be forming some kind of reconnaissance, gathering information about the victim, in preparation for an attack on them. So there's a few ways of looking at risk escalation in cases of stalking. But if you receive a disclosure from a victim of what appears to be stalking, they might not call it stalking. They might just say, this person's constantly phoning me, they won't stop, they keep turning up, they've left flowers on the doorstep. That's basically stalking. Remember that is happening over halfway along this timeline, over halfway. So at the point that you are being told about it, we've already been through 4 or 5 other risk escalations before this behaviour actually starts. So should always be taken very, very seriously. And remember too that they are not benign. They can be incredibly dangerous. Of all the stalking groups, they are the most dangerous. There is another group, the predatory stalker. They can be very dangerous as well, but they are much, much fewer in number. There's not nearly so many of them. Right. So we move on then. Now we're getting into the stages that are actually really very dangerous. So they haven't circled back in stage 5. They've done the most dangerous thing, which is to progress along this timeline. And we move into stage 6, which we call homicidal ideation. You could call it a change in thinking. This is where the situation is perceived to be irreversible or irretrievable by the controlling person. And they can have in their head what the stalking research calls last chance thinking, which is very rigid and very final. And we have noticed behaviours at stage 6 where the term last chance becomes really, really concerning. You know, we have seen a lot of cases where victims have said they're going for a last chance meeting, a last chance holiday, a last chance cup of coffee, whatever, to see if things can't be. And sometimes victims will go to these last chance meetings thinking that they want to keep things stable, they want to be reasonable, but it can be a really, really dangerous thing to do. The last chance bit of it can actually just mean this is your last chance to put things right, because I've already started deciding how I'm going to deal with this. So homicidal ideation is basically thinking that you think there is an option to resolve your issues through homicide, and that starts to form in stage 6. So there are some signs. We can't spend a huge amount of time talking about the signs, but we can talk about some. If the person starts talking about death in any context, so they may be saying things like, I'm going to kill myself if you don't come back to me, or I'm going to kill you if you don't come back to me, or I could kill you if I wanted to, you better watch your step. Now, any talk about death means that they are now thinking about this situation in those terms, and that is really concerning. It doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a murder tomorrow, but it does mean they're on that journey. They are escalating towards that. The stalking might change from trying to get the relationship back together to intelligence gathering. The victim might be concerned about sudden changes in behaviour. Any threats they do make may become more specific. So they may go from, I'm going to kill you, to, I'm going to strangle you. Things have become more specific. They've started thinking about it. They've maybe started visualising it. They may be in the early stages of even planning it. Things could come suddenly calm at this stage, but equally they could intensify. I think we're just some very, very quick case examples, Sue. So we
Are you saying I talk a lot, Jane?
No, I'm just saying we're doing a much shorter
Yes. Yeah.
process than we normally do. So stage 6 changes. Now, I mentioned the guy teas at 5 o'clock every night, and this had been going on for 20 years. Now, in this particular case, what we found out after the homicide, and we found out by talking to the grown-up children of this relationship, they'd left home by this time, but she, their mother, was still living in the house with him, but they had decided to separate, and they were staying in the house whilst it was sold. And the night before he killed her, she phoned up her children and said, you'll never guess what's happened tonight. Tea was at 5:30. And the kids said, what? You're kidding me. You've got to be joking. 5:30? That had never happened before in 20 years. He didn't need that routine anymore. He didn't need to test everybody's, the control he had over everybody. And she also said he just sat there sneering at her throughout the meal. So his behaviour had changed, but not in a way that she interpreted as a threat to her life. Do you want to talk about the Gloucester
Oh,
case?
the Gloucester case. So there was a double murder, a woman and her 11-year-old child in 2018. And Christopher Boone was the man who killed them. He was married to Laura, but Ella was his stepdaughter, which is something else we should mention later, Jane, about stepchildren being in danger in these situations. But Laura had told Boone that he'd had an affair, and she'd said she wanted to end the marriage. They were living in the same house because financial reasons they had to. But in the weeks leading up to the murders, Boone sent flowers to Laura and her sister, her auntie, her mum, her grand, a lot of female relations, and he sent flowers to them, and the card said sorry. That's all it said. So it wasn't was he already thinking what he was going to do, or was he trying to apologise for past behaviour? I mean, the relatives didn't think much of it. They just didn't like him anyway. They just thought he was being a bit weird. But also in the days leading up to the deaths, he purchased a knife. And he took one of his younger children with him when he purchased the knife, and he told her, "This is Daddy's special knife." And he kept it in a drawer in the kitchen. Now, nobody knew the significance of that knife. It didn't come out at the trial. It didn't come out in the domestic homicide review. But he obviously planted that knife in the kitchen, everyone thought that he grabbed a knife from the knife block on the kitchen worktop. But he didn't. And the other strange thing he did was he shaved his head. Now, this was a man who was very proud of his hair and always kept it looking nice, but he shaved his head, so he was almost looked bald. So there was 3 significant things before he murdered his wife and his stepdaughter.
And Alan Hoare, who we were talking about earlier, from Ireland, across that entire relationship, Clodagh used to see her mum, but only ever in Alan Hoare's presence. She was never allowed to see her mum on her own. In the days before she was murdered, he suddenly drove her around to her mum's and left her there for an hour, allowed the 2 women to talk on their own, and they thought, wow, this is unusual, but this is great. And another thing he did that was only the relevant scene after the homicide, and was told to me by the family, was that he moved all the furniture around in the living room. Now, it transpired afterwards that he'd moved the furniture around in the living room, and he'd never done this before. He was a very routine man. Things in that house did not change. It turned out that he had to move the furniture around because he was going to kill Clodagh and their 3 children, and he needed to be able to kill Clodagh first and quietly, because otherwise she would interfere and try and save her sons, and that might have scuppered the whole plan. So he had moved the furniture so that Clodagh's back, when she was sitting at her desk, would be to the door, and he could come in without her seeing him and take her by surprise to kill her. So there was 2 things there that were very clearly changes in behaviour, and we've seen in an awful lot of cases sudden changes in behaviour that nobody really at the time thought were particularly concerning. I'm just looking at the time here. So I think, we can't really give any more case examples, but I think, we've kind of made our point about the type of things that can happen in this stage. So talking about death, sudden changes, and this last chance kind of thinking. But we'll just listen to Clive now talking about stage 6.
Alice eventually went to the police after a particularly disturbing episode. She was living in a ground floor flat in Gateshead across the river from where she worked in Newcastle. Friends would bring her home every day. Her bedroom was at the back of the flat and was fairly easily accessible. You leaped over a 5-foot wall to get into the back garden. And one evening, there'd been a number of calls at the front door, which she was padlocking by this time, and she couldn't see anyone out the keyhole. She was alone in the house that night. Her flatmate was away. And after she'd gone to bed, there was a knock on her bedroom window. When she opened the curtains, there was Dylan, and he'd driven all the way down from Edinburgh, and he'd left a box of chocolates and some flowers on the windowsill and was backing off with his hands in the air as if to say, okay, I'm going now. As he drove back to Edinburgh, he left a particularly horrible voice message on her phone, which he dictated as he was driving, in which he said, I just came down to bring you chocolates because to show you that I wasn't thinking of killing you. I would never think of killing you. And he goes on and on and on. In this horrible message, he mentions not killing her 6 or 7 more times. And clearly what that's telling us is that killing her was very much on his mind by then.
So we move to stage 7 now, which is the planning stage. Historically, we've always thought of intimate partner homicides as crimes of passion, if you like, that happen in the moment. Somebody loses their temper, they feel provoked, they lash out. The research does not support that at all. In fact, the research, not just ours, supports that there is a planning stage. There was some research in the United States that said that in 85% of their cases, they found levels of planning. And we concur with that. So most of these homicides are actually planned. Even if the planning isn't meticulous, there is levels of planning there. So they do go through stages 6 and 7. And those stages can, of course, overlap. So some of the things that we saw in stage 7, I mean, stalking is usually carrying on and those changes. We start to see maybe opportunity creation. How am I going to get access to this person? We might see an increased menace. But some of the things that might make it, and you know, these don't happen in all cases. We're just giving you some examples. One of the most common things that reveals planning is internet search history. So in many, many cases, you go through the internet search history and it'll be there, you know, how to commit the perfect murder, how to bury a body, how much of this drug do I need to make sure someone's dead, where do I stab someone? Quite a lot of times, those internet search histories have revealed a planning stage. They may as well tell people of their plans, but people very rarely take that seriously. They think, oh, you know, that's just this person, you know, going off on one. They're not going to actually do it. We don't believe them. They may, like Sue has just described, start gathering weapons or other tools. They may form, in fact, what you might call murder kits. Murder kits have been definitely present in quite a few cases. Do you want to talk about the Staff's stalker when we were at Staffordshire Police that day?
Oh, yeah.
They showed us the photos.
Yes, they did. We were doing some other research, and just by chance, I think the photograph was up on a board, wasn't it, Jane?
No.
Was it not? Oh, I thought, well, anyway, they had apprehended a guy who had been reported stalking his wife. She rung in to say. So they stopped him, and they found in the boot of his car a murder kit, you know, plastic sheets, gaffer tape, rope, and all sorts of other things that he could have used against her. And it was eye-opening for us to see that, you know, because those sorts of materials in a construction engineer's van you wouldn't worry about, but in a car, in the boot of a car, it was all very neatly laid out, and yeah, very bizarre.
But yeah, we saw there's another case, a man called Alan Pemberton. He had a murder kit in the back of his car as well, and he'd been planning the murder of his wife Julia probably for about 16 months, we think, or anything up to 16 months, but he could not get access to her. But across that 16 months, the stalking never stopped. The threats never stopped. He moved in with another woman. He had another relationship going, but he was still harassing Julia. And they had 2 teenage children as well. And he actually ended up shooting his teenage son. And he shot himself at the scene, as well as shooting Julia. And they found meticulous plans written down on paper. So he had been, you know, not just researching, not just gathering weapons, but writing down meticulous plan of how this was going to play out. It didn't play out according to those plans, though, because looking at the plans, it does not appear that he meant to or had planned to kill Will, his 17-year-old son. He had only planned to kill Julia, but things, you know, on the day, things happened differently. Will tried to stop him, and he shot him 4 or 5 times, actually, to stop him. And Will did receive a posthumous medal for bravery. So there's another case that's really interesting that you may have heard of. It was very high profile over here. Terrible, terrible case of a man called Mick Philpott, who had been in a relationship with 2 women at the same time, and they were both living in the same house with him. And there were 10 children from those 2 relationships also living in the house. One of the women decided to leave, managed to leave under cover of kind of darkness or whatever, when he wasn't there anyway. He was so angry that she had left him that he made plans to get back at her. So what he did was he set fire to his own house and tried to make it look as if his ex-partner had set the fire. Well, in doing that, he killed 6 of his own children who were still living in the house. Tried to say, you know, that it wasn't him and everything, but the police used like audio devices to record him talking to the woman who was left and a neighbour, and they revealed their plans to do this. I don't think he planned that the children would die, but he was certainly reckless or willing for that, you know, to be an outcome. So, you know, all sorts of different cases, this timeline can come in. Now, we're just going to, are there any cases you particularly want to mention, Sue, around planning?
No, I don't think so. I think Rachel's is a bit long, isn't it?
It's quite long, but you could shorten it.
I can shorten it. There's a case in 2011, Rachel Williams from Wales, who was almost killed by her ex-husband, estranged husband. But his meticulous planning involved testing the branch where he eventually killed himself. He hung himself from a tree, but he'd been there before and tested the branch that it would take his weight, because he was a mountain of a man. He was 6'7", God knows how much. He had a 60-inch chest, I think, Jane, if I remember rightly, and a real bully. But leading up to the murder, he had dogs that he used to take hunting, and he was devoted to them. But he rehomed them. which was very, very strange. You know, Rachel says now, if she knew then what she knows now, she would have alerted the police to that behaviour, but obviously she didn't. But he also, they'd been married for 18 years, but he'd had affairs, and he rang up these ex-girlfriends and apologised for the way he treated them. Very bizarre behaviour.
It was bizarre, wasn't it?
Very bizarre,
that, rehoming the dogs, that's that my life's coming to an end kind of thing, isn't it? And in George and Edna, in fact, he had gone out in the days before he killed Edna and got his will sorted out, got cash to pay the builders and people that he owed money to, the paper boy, all of this, and he laid it all out on the table. Neatly, so that when they were found, everything was in place. You know, he'd tidied up all his affairs. So these, I suppose the point is, they're not crimes of passion that happen in the moment that nobody could have predicted. So we'll just listen to Clive talk about stage 7.
The flowers and chocolates incident was on the 30th of September. During the week that followed, she had the police issue a pin against him to try and stop him coming back to see her. But of course, that was just a challenge to his control. And a week later, he sent her a package in which he was returning things and saying, "Okay, I'm never going to come near you again." She didn't believe that. And on the 10th of October, just 10 days after that incident, unbeknown to anyone at the time, but it emerged in the trial later, he drove all the way down to her flat and came around the back and took photos of the back windows. He was reconnoitring the place. He was seeing how he could get in and planning for what was to follow just 2 days later.
So I think, you know, Clive is describing there how the stalking behaviour, the motivation moved on and on until it became intelligence gathering to help him with his plans that he was going to kill her. There's just one thing I want to very briefly mention. I would normally go on and on about it, but breaches of orders, breaches of bail. Any breach should be taken incredibly seriously, no matter what constitutes the breach. So the fact there has been a breach is a escalation in risk, and it's not so much the nature of the breach as the fact that there has been a breach that is your main risk escalation clue. So if somebody is under order from the court not to contact somebody and they do contact them, that is the risk escalation. If they contact them via a text, it doesn't matter. It is still a breach. They know it's a breach. They're testing the system. So if you can, always act on a breach. Now we move on to stage 8, which is the homicide. Now this can play out in any number of ways as well. It could be a clear homicide with a confession. The 5 o'clock tea guy, when he killed his wife as she walked in the front door coming home from work, he made sure she was dead and then just phoned the police and said, "Come and get me." It could be a homicide-suicide, like we've described in a number of the cases, Alan Hoare and Alan Pemberton as well. It could be a staged suicide. They're a lot more common than you would think. We've done a suicide timeline as well, and really concerning. Could be a mercy killing. This happens a lot, especially where women become ill, maybe with dementia or other problems. It could be an accident, a fall, a car crash. We've had 2 cases that I can think of in the last few years here where the police have managed to prove that car accidents were purposeful, and victims have ended up dying in them, but not the perpetrators. Could be even natural causes, but you know, we haven't got time to tell you the ins and outs of how natural causes are actually homicide. It could be a missing person. And Sue, you mentioned children, didn't you? So children, we tend to think that children will never be targets for homicide. We should not be thinking like that in cases of coercive control. So research is saying 3 main scenarios. 1, the children are not there when the homicide happens if there are children in the relationship. They're staying with relatives or whatever, they're not there. The second is they are there and they witness the homicide. The third is they are there and they are targets for homicide and they lose their lives too. The most common of those 3 is that the children will be there and they will witness the homicide. Now, children can become collateral damage. I think I just mentioned Will. He was 17. He wasn't planned that he was going to get killed, but because he was there and he was witnessing it, he tried to intervene and he became a target. Do you want very briefly about the Gloucester case, Sue?
Yeah, the Gloucester case is Laura, and Ella was the 11-year-old little girl that was killed. She intervened. She tried to stop Christopher Boone attacking her mum. She was so close to her mum. And she ended up being stabbed more times in the face, shoulders, neck and head than her mother. She was stabbed 24 times ferociously. And her mother was stabbed 18 times. But yeah, she was trying to defend her mum.
And she was a stepchild.
Yes, she was a stepchild. Absolutely.
And there is research that tells us that stepchildren are at much higher risk, and there's actually a higher homicide risk if there are stepchildren in the family. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that step-parents are a bad thing, but
no.
The research is saying in these cases of coercive control, where there are stepchildren, those children are at higher risk, which is why it is so crucial we identify coercive control, and instead of thinking, nah, that's not happening, see it as the serious issue that it is. We're just going to play. Sorry, were you saying something?
No, I'm fine.
Right. We'll just play Clive talking about stage 8.
On the 12th of October, Alice was brought home by a friend, as often happened. She got home about 6 o'clock, went in, locked the door, and she was busy WhatsApping with Mike, who was her new boyfriend. And about 6:20, the messages to Mike suddenly stopped. Her flatmate, Maxine, came back just 10-15 minutes after that, found all the lights on in the place still locked up and completely quiet. When she went round the back, she herself climbed in the back window and discovered Alice in the bathroom, and he'd been climbed in the meantime. And I can't talk about that. He was in a state of denial. Obviously, Maxine was screaming his name when the police arrived, and they arrested him up at his barracks a few hours later, and brought him back down. And there is film footage of what happened then and what he said, but he was in a complete state of denial. He denied quite coolly that he'd even been there. And as the evidence mounted up, he's changed his story. By the time it came to court, he was arguing that she'd tried to kill him and killed herself in the process.
That's the graphic that shows the 8 stages. You can have a high-res version of that if you would want it for your office. And I've just got some final comments. Travel through all of these stages is not inevitable. As I said, most will circle back to stage 1 or circle back to stage 3. They will stop progressing around stage 5. Coercive control is constantly in operation. It's always there. Victims always feel that they're walking on eggshells. So think about chronic fear. Breaches respond to breaches of orders, irrespective of the nature of the breach. And think about your what would happen if questions. You know, those ones are, what are the consequences going to be of this? Or what would happen if you didn't answer the phone immediately? What would happen if you wore this kind of clothes? It can tell you a lot. And think about how stalking motivation can develop and change. And I think we've just about finished exactly on time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can.
But Jane,
Yeah.
would you please answer a couple of questions if there are any?
Of course, I'm just trying to find my way. Have I stopped? Oh no, it's
Not
there.
quite, not quite. You just
Have I
keep
done it?
Yeah, well, no. Oh, now you have, now you have.
Now I have.
Yeah.
Eru einhverjar spurningar til þeirra?
Hi. My name is Maria, and thank you very much. It's very interesting and enlightening. I just want to ask, like, how big of a proportion of these homicides would be disguised as sex games gone wrong?
Well, I can't give you the actual numbers, but we have like an organisation over here that are tracking the sex game gone wrong homicides, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot. I can't tell you what proportion of them, you know, of the homicides, but it's quite a lot. I think they picked up about 60 that they were looking at that had happened over a few years. We put legislation, such was the problem, we put some legislation in basically saying that defence was not going to be open to people anymore, that they could say, you know, they strangled somebody and it was just an accident that this person died. I will talk to you in response to that about non-fatal strangulation. We've just brought in legislation, and there's been legislation in the United States for a long time, reflecting the danger of non-fatal strangulation and making it a standalone offence. Because one thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that non-fatal strangulation raises the risk for homicide by 750%, and control and violence and separation together, the three things together, raise the risk by 900%. So if you've got somebody claiming a sex game gone wrong and they have used strangulation, chances are they are the type of person who is exerting control and are more likely to be the kind of person to kill, because non-fatal strangulation doesn't mean, you know, if somebody kills by strangulation who's done that, they're not killing their partners by accident. That's not what the research is saying. They're saying they are more likely. So probably a lot more cases than you think.
Okay.
But I can't give you a number.
Okay. There is a question over there.
Hi, Jane and Sue. It was very interesting. My name is Valgerður. Well, I'm interested if you can tell me more about the situation of the stepchildren. Why do you think they're in more risk than the other children?
There's been quite a lot of research into the presence of a stepchild in these controlling relationships. And one of the reasons put forward is that they are a constant reminder of a previous relationship. They're not biologically related, and they're seen almost like a cuckoo in the nest. So there is resentment towards them, is what has been found in some research.
And can I just add that in the case of Ella, it came out after the death that she had been labelled at school as a naughty child, you know, always misbehaving, because no one was listening to her. She wanted to tell people what was going on at home, we feel sure, but nobody gave her a voice, which was very, very sad. So it's about educators recognising or, you know, looking into home lives of some children that they know to be stepchildren as well.
Okay, here we have a third question. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ragna, and I'm a social worker working in a high-risk custody cases as a mediator. And you talked about that if people survivors would say they were survivors of violence, they will not be believed.